I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's December 13th, and we have a lot to talk about. Some of you might remember that at the end of October, I was in Amsterdam attending the 2022 ECTRIMS Congress. Now, ECTRIMS is an acronym for the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis, and their annual scientific congress is the largest MS research conference in the world. And as the conference was literally ending, I sat on some steps outside the conference center alongside the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo, and Dr. Bebo shared his initial impressions of some of the research that had been presented over the 3-day conference. If you missed that episode of the podcast, you may want to listen to episode number 270, and I'll include a link to that episode in today's show notes. Today, Dr. Bebo is back with us. After having had a few weeks to consider all of the research that was presented at the ECTRIMS Congress, he's going to share his final ECTRIMS research update and talk about the rest of the research presented at ECTRIMS that caught his attention. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Bebo, there's someone else I'd like you to meet. When people ask me how I go about deciding who to interview for the podcast, my answer has always been the same. I look for difference makers, people whose efforts are making a difference in the MS community. They might be world-class researchers, clinicians, extraordinary fundraisers, activists, caregivers. The list gets pretty long. But the one thing that everyone I invite onto the podcast has in common is that they're out there each in their own way, making a real difference that ultimately improves the lives of people affected by MS. Dr. Bebo certainly fits that definition. And so does the person you're about to meet, Kristen Karasek. Kristen was diagnosed with MS when she was just 24 years old. Today, she's the co-chair of the National MS Society's Southern California chapter's Emerging Leaders Board. She's the very definition of positivity. And this past September, Kristen was honored with the Dorothy Corwin Spirit of Life Award at the MS Society Southern California chapter's Dinner of Champions. In a moment, we'll meet my guest, Kristen Karasek. Kristen Karasek is a dancer. She's danced almost since birth. Kristen started entering dance competitions by the time she was 6 years old and continued competing through college. And in 2008, at the age of 24, Kristen was diagnosed with MS. Today, Kristen is the co-chair of the National MS Society Southern California chapter's Emerging Leaders Board. Welcome to the podcast, Kristen.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
Let's go back to 2008 for a moment. What were the circumstances that led to your diagnosis?
Well, I'll start at the beginning. I had been traveling. I went to New York to visit some family and friends on a work trip for the dance studios. And while I was there, I visited friends' family. For all intents and purposes, it was a completely normal weekend. And when I flew back home that night, a Monday, I kind of had a funky headache, so I went to bed early. And I woke up the next morning with a sunburn sensation down the left side of my body. I thought it was kind of weird, but I also figured I must have pinched a nerve dancing and not realized it. So I went to see the orthopedist and he told me take 2 Advil and come back in a few weeks if the pain persists. But something wasn't sitting right with me. So I made an appointment to go into my general doctor that Friday. And I went to see him and my appointment was an A+. Everything looked great. And as I was leaving, they said, the doctor would like you to take a few MRIs just to be safe. And I said, okay, no problem. And they said, we're ready for you now. So right away, I'm like, what? Ready for me now? I just had a perfectly good exam. But they said, no, the doctor wants you to go just to be cautious right now to the scanning facility. So I went to get my MRIs done, which isn't that fun if you're claustrophobic and have only had 10 minutes to prepare or so. And I was in there for a while. Anyone who has been through the MRIs for MS knows that it takes a long time because there's a lot of different parts of your body to scan. And when I got out, the technician said, everything looks great. You have nothing to worry about, because he could tell that I had been nervous. And so I got dressed. And as I was walking out the front door, the same technician came running out and said, ma'am, I need you to get back in the machine. There are a few more images I need to get. And so I went back in and I got back in the machine. But from that second on, I felt like the technician couldn't quite look me in the eyes anymore. So something was telling me something is wrong. So I continued on with my day. I went to work. I was teaching dance at an elementary school. So teaching musical theater, probably The Little Mermaid or something, to tons of 13 and 14-year-old girls and boys. And my mom walked into the auditorium, and she had never been there before. It was my workplace. And so she came over and she said, the doctor called and he wants to see you back in his office with us by the end of the afternoon. And so now I'm kind of freaking out, right? Because this process started at 10 in the morning with a totally normal exam, and now has progressed to stat MRIs, getting back in the machine a second time. And now my mom is at my workplace and the doctor wants to see me back in his office right away. So I wasn't sure what to expect. And we went to the office together as a family, sitting in one of those sterile little waiting rooms, kind of waiting. And the doctor came in and he said, I believe you have MS. So for me, diagnosis almost took no time at all. I woke up on Tuesday feeling kind of funny. And by Friday, they said, we think it's MS. So for me, everything changed overnight.
What happened next?
The doctor recommended next that I go into the hospital for some subsequent testing and also for my first steroid treatment. So I did that. And things were going really well. I was, struggling to come to terms with it, but also was still feeling pretty good except for the sunburn sensation. So when I walked into the hospital, they asked, who's the patient? I still wasn't showing any physical symptoms of the disease yet. After my hospital stay and in the weeks to come, that's when the disease kind of caught up with the rest of me. And I started having more severe symptoms. So that went on probably around Thanksgiving of 2008 until early January of 2009, at least.
I'm curious, you were diagnosed in 2008. I know that by 2010, you had begun doing fundraising for the National MS Society.
Yes.
What was important about that to you?
As soon as I was diagnosed, I felt like I had a very good support system surrounding me, family and friends and students and parents from our dance studio. And I immediately felt like I was given this challenge for some greater purpose. And I didn't know what it was at the time, but when my friend approached me and asked if I wanted to fundraise, I thought, maybe this is it. So let's do it. And I immediately jumped into fundraising and getting as many people involved as possible. And I felt at the time that I had like a decent sized platform because I had the dance studio in California and we had a dance studio in New York at the time. So it was an easy way to get a lot of people involved to raise a lot of money quickly.
So your decision to connect with the MS Society, how has that involvement impacted you?
My decision to become involved in the MS Society has really changed everything for me over the course of the last decade. And when I started, I had all the intentions of fundraising, but I never thought it would be a life-changing adventure I was taking on. I started fundraising and have become so involved through the years that I never imagined I would feel like the MS Society has given me kind of a second family, a home, an additional support system, and all these different avenues with which I can affect change and help other people.
When I introduced you, I mentioned that you are co-chair of the Emerging Leaders Board. Can you talk a little bit about what the Emerging Leaders Board is all about and what your role is on the ELB?
Sure. The Emerging Leaders Board is a group of young professionals put together by the National MS Society, in this case, the Southern California chapter. And they came to us in 2017 and said, we'd like to start a junior fundraising board aimed at the 20 to 40-year-old demographic. And we'd like you guys to set it up and structure it. And we think you're the right group for it. And so we kind of took it from there and started in someone's backyard as a kind of a grassroots fundraising effort and said, okay, what do we do now? And we talked a lot about what we wanted to do and what funding we wanted to raise and what we thought people our age needed pre-diagnosis and after diagnosis for the whole journey. And so we structured it from that. And our most recent event, just this past August, raised $100,000, a little over $100,000 for our summer soiree. So the Emerging Leaders Board is primarily a fundraising board, but we also are very interested in serving our demographic. So we have branched out into advocacy and MS support, and we have people on the board working to build brand awareness and awareness for the MS Society at large, and tell people out there who are going through this, whether they're patients or caretakers, that we're here and we exist and we're a group that's looking to get involved and help.
So I'm curious, what kind of challenges might a young adult who's living with MS face that maybe an older person wouldn't?
Ooh, that's a good question. And this might be partly the teacher in me. I think one of the challenges that younger people today face that the older generation is not as exposed to is social media and how things can be portrayed on social media. You know, social media is everyone's, for the most part, highlight reel. And so, well, I think it's a really good tool for people to research and kind of shop around and see if there's other people out there experiencing the same things. I hope they keep in mind that everyone who has any chronic illness, especially MS, has their own daily challenges that you cannot see or tell from social media, regardless of what it is showing, you know?
This past year, you were an honoree at the National MS Society Southern California Chapter's Dinner of Champions as a recipient of the Dorothy Corwin Spirit of Life Award. So first, let me say congratulations again. But tell me, what was that experience like for you?
Oh, it was so surreal. It was such an honor. And when I got the phone call, I didn't get a phone call. I got an email and I called my sister to tell her. And I was like, I can't believe it. They want me to be the Spirit of Life honoree. And it's like the Oscars for MS. And she was like, it totally is. And we were so excited. And it just meant so much to me to have grown so much in my own journey and with the MS Society to be looked upon as one of the people they felt should be honored with it.
You know, there may be someone who's going to listen to this conversation who could be around 24, 25 years old. Maybe they've just recently been diagnosed with MS. What would you say to them?
I would say, in my experience, the beginning is the hardest, and you feel isolated even if you have a really great support system. But there's light at the end of the tunnel, and the programs and the disease-modifying therapies that they're coming up with are changing the scope of MS every day. So it's changed so much in the last 20 years that if you're in your 20s and you're being diagnosed right now, you have to keep that hope and spirit and just know that changes are coming and do what you can to work towards them, whether it be just by yourself or with a group like the Emerging Leaders Board. And the other personal thing I would say is I heard a quote a long time ago that I really liked, and it said, you're dealing with this now and you're struggling with it. And when you wake up every day, it's going to be the first thing you think of. But one day you're going to wake up and it's going to be the second. And that cannot be more true. And then it just gets further and further down the line, hopefully.
So you said something interesting just now. You said the beginning is the hardest. So maybe a two-part question there. Outside of the obvious shock that now you've been diagnosed and before that moment you hadn't been. So outside of that, what do you think makes it the hardest and how can that part be made better for people?
I think what makes it the hardest is the unknown. So for me, I had people talk about like their worst nightmare coming true. Like I had never even dreamed up such a thing. So I was completely blindsided by this diagnosis. And it's really startling, especially when you're so young, to go from 100% fine to 100% patient in no time at all. And that's scary. And you don't know what your life's going to look like moving forward. And you don't know, exactly what it's going to be. But for me, it helped to remember, even though MS presented a lot of challenges through the years, if you're newly diagnosed and if you're looking about your day-to-day life, once you get out of that, probably the first few month period, there aren't that many changes in your day-to-day life, right? Like your family and friends are still there for you. No one loves you because you don't have MS. So you having MS doesn't change that. Hopefully you're still able to continue working or being involved in a hobby that you love. So for me, I always thought whatever changes, I will modify how I am involved in it so I can continue doing the things I love. And I think to keep that in mind when you're first diagnosed, where there is a will, there is a way. If you want to do something, there is a way to do it, even though it might not look exactly like it did before.
Kristen Karasek, thank you for your fundraising efforts. Thank you for your leadership and your commitment to connect with and support other young adults who are living with MS. And thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
As we head toward the end of 2022, it seems like an ideal time to look at some of the potentially game-changing MS research that was announced at the 2022 ECTRIMS Congress and get a sense of how that research could affect people who are living with MS. There's no one better suited for that task than my guest, the Executive Vice President of Research for the National MS Society, Dr. Bruce Bebo. If you're a regular RealTalk MS listener, you might remember episode number 270. It was the episode that I recorded sitting on the steps outside the conference center in Amsterdam, where the ECTRIMS Congress, the largest MS research conference in the world, was literally drawing to a close. And joining me on the steps outside that conference center was the Executive Vice President of Research for the National MS Society, Dr. Bruce Bebo. And Dr. Bebo was gracious enough to share some of his initial reactions to a few of the hundreds of presentations that were given over the course of the 3-day Congress. Now, at the end of that episode, I told you that Dr. Bebo would be back once he had a chance to let the rest of those presentations sort of settle in his mind. And he's joining me today to close the loop on the 2022 ECTRIMS research presentations that he found particularly interesting. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Bebo.
Great to be with you, John.
So it's been just over a month since the 2022 ECTRIMS Congress came to an end. When you think about the research that was presented, what's sort of risen to the top of your mind?
Yeah, and I've had a little time to kind of digest and think and review. One of the areas of research that I'd love to highlight to your listeners is this area of biomarkers. And I'm going to explain what biomarkers are and how they might be beneficial to people living with MS and what we learned last month at ECTRIMS about progress we've made in biomarkers for MS. So it's a matter of a definition. A biomarker really it's a way to objectively measure some kind of indicator of either a normal biological process, a disease process, or even response to a therapeutic intervention. And for people with MS, what a biomarker could do, it could do a number of things. So it could help us determine if someone is responding to therapy in a really quick way, could be quicker, faster, cheaper than potentially than an MRI scan would be. And it could help inform, for example, treatment decisions, perhaps decisions related to changing therapies. It could also help predict, maybe prognosticate the course of disease that someone might experience, and also in a way inform a treatment decision. Should you perhaps be treated with a more effective treatment early on if your course of disease may potentially be more serious, and that would be a very valuable information to know. It could help us diagnose MS a lot faster and a lot more accurately. And it has the potential to identify people who are at high risk for MS, which I think could really lead to the development of very early treatment, even before clinical signs of MS become apparent, with very likely improved outcomes. Perhaps it could even lead to preventing the clinical signs of MS one day. So this would be something that would be quicker, cheaper, and could be performed more often than an MRI scan, although I don't think this is going to ever replace an annual MRI for most people. And there was a lot of progress about biomarkers. It was a highlight at the ECTRIMS meeting last month in Amsterdam. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. One of the leading biomarkers is called serum neurofilament light chain, or NFL is the easier way to remember it. And we're learning what this biomarker is actually telling us about MS. And we're getting closer to this actually being a test that we could use to help make treatment decisions. We've talked about this before, but this NFL is a structural protein in nerve cells. And when nerve cells get damaged, this protein gets released and we can measure it in the blood. And it is becoming a valuable biomarker that's elevated, particularly during relapses. And it also correlates with new lesion development. And many of the disease-modifying treatments that we have been shown to lower the levels of neurofilament light chain in the blood. One of the challenges with neurofilament light chain is it's not specific to MS. It just indicates generally that your nervous system's been damaged. And there are a few other things that essentially our knowledge needs to build in order before we can use this clinically in individuals with MS. So, for example, we're learning that NFL levels go up as we age, and they're lower in people that have a high body mass index. That's probably related to the volume of blood people have. And there are certain medical conditions, for example, like kidney disease, that can affect NFL levels. So progress is being made. Some of that progress was reported last month at the ECTRIMS meeting on generating that information, that data we're going to need to know in order to establish what normal levels are in different age groups and how these other health conditions affect the levels of NFL. And then once we've got a good understanding of what the normal levels are in different populations, different ages, we should be able to start using this test to actually help to diagnose and inform treatment decisions in individual people with MS. I want to talk about one more biomarker that was discussed quite a bit last month. This is an emerging biomarker called GFAP, and it's an acronym that stands for glial fibrillary acidic protein. Not important to remember that, but it's a structural protein in brain cells that are called astrocytes. And the astrocytes are the most abundant cell in your nervous system, and they perform really critical support functions for your nerve cells. And when they get damaged, they release this protein, this GFAP protein. So what we've learned, and some of which we learned last month, that levels are higher in people that have any kind of brain trauma, including MS. Data was presented during the meeting that blood GFAP levels could complement what we learned from the neurofilament light chain. And I think, John, that one day it may be a panel of biomarkers, including NFL and GFAP and some other emerging biomarkers used in combination that I think might really help inform the diagnosis of MS, help us prognosticate the course of disease, and help us understand how people are responding to therapy and course correct more quickly than we're able to do now.
That's going to make incredible difference for anybody going to the clinic to see their neurologist, their MS specialist, for that 6-month or annual appointment, or any time they have a sense that perhaps something's going on and they need to be checked out. What an easy, user-friendly way to do that.
Yeah, and I think maybe some people don't fully realize that while MRI has revolutionized the way we diagnose and treat MS, in an individual person, the images you see in the MRI scan don't always correlate to what's happening to a person clinically. And certainly people can feel great and not have any symptoms or relapses, but the activity within the nervous system is progressing, even though it's not manifesting clinically. And it may be wise to switch to a therapy, and NFL or other biomarkers might be able to inform that switching more quickly, detect that subclinical disease activity before it manifests clinically, I think that's another promising use of the biomarker like NFL and GFAP. And I had a little more time to think about progress that has been made in the different pathways and pathways to cures. I know we've talked about this many times in your program, John, that society has led the development of a global Pathways to Cures initiative that has 3 pathways in this roadmap to cures: stop, restore, and end. And progress in all 3 of those pathways were made and reported last month at the ECTRIMS meeting. One of the, I'd say, leading pharmacological advances that are being made in stopping MS is in a pathway that's regulated by a molecule called Bruton's tyrosine kinase. And the easy way to remember this is BTK. BTK is a signaling molecule, and signaling molecules in general help cells sense their environment and then gives instructions to the cell machinery for how to react to the environment. And this particular signaling molecule, this BTK molecule, is especially prominent in immune cells called B cells. And we know now that B cells are really important participants in the immune response that causes MS. And we know this because there are 2 pretty new disease-modifying therapies for MS that target B cells, Ocrevus and Kesimpta. And these 2 medications have been shown to be really effective, especially for relapsing forms of MS. So it turns out also that some of the cells that we think are contributing to progressive MS also express BTK. And we suspect that inhibition of BTK, in addition to inhibiting B cells in relapsing MS, could also lead to reduction in the compartmentalized immune responses that we think are driving more slowly progressive MS. So we heard updates last month that from most of, probably not all of the 5 different BTK research programs, really confirming that this is a promising target for both relapsing and progressive forms of MS. There are half a dozen or more phase 3, the final phase in clinical development, phase 3 trials testing BTK inhibitors for MS. And we should know pretty soon more about this promising class of therapies. And we talk a lot about pharmaceutical interventions, but I'd also love to talk a little bit about some non-pharmaceutical interventions that we think could contribute to helping slow down or stop disease progression. So one study that was presented by Dr. Laura Picchio at Washington University in St. Louis, who conducted a small clinical trial comparing intermittent fasting with typical Western diet over 12 weeks in a group of a little over 40 people with relapsing MS. And they found that intermittent fasting, so what this means, this isn't so fun, but it means eating about 500 calories a day for 2 days out of a 7-day week. And what they found was that in the people on this intermittent fasting diet, that their blood levels of these 2 markers, leptin and adiponectin, were altered in a way that indicates they reduced inflammation. And the study also showed that intermittent fasting reduced MRI lesions and appeared to produce beneficial changes in certain brain structures that suggest that it may be a, again, non-pharmaceutical approach for slowing down or stopping MS.
I know my listeners are always looking for that non-pharmaceutical treatment that might actually give them a real benefit. That sounds really promising.
Yeah, I agree. And while we're on that topic, there was also data presented about some non-pharmaceutical interventions for restoring lost function, repairing the nervous system. So the literature, the scientific literature has shown that enhancing neuronal activity, electrical activity, can accelerate myelin repair. And so how can you do this in a person, non-invasively? So there's a technology that's called transcranial direct current stimulation. This is non-invasive. It's some electrodes you get placed on your head that are focused on certain areas of your nervous system. And a research group from the San Raffaele Institute in Milan, Italy, reported that this direct current stimulation could improve myelination of the optic nerve in an animal model of MS. It hasn't been tested in humans yet, but it's very promising that it could help improve remyelination in animal models of MS. That would be kind of a cool discovery if it turns out to work well for humans. I think we talked about this, John, while we were together in Amsterdam, but perhaps worth mentioning again, this online treatment for depression.
Yes.
That was a study that was performed by Dr. Stefan Gold at the Charité University in Berlin. And what they tested was a 12-week computerized cognitive behavioral program. It's called Deprexis. And they tested this in almost 280 people with all forms of MS. And what the study showed was that it was safe, that it reduced depression and improved quality of life, and that those benefits were maintained for over up to a year after the completion of the program. It's perhaps important to say it doesn't completely cure depression. I'm not sure we have any cures for depression, but it's certainly an option that one can consider, and particularly if a person has challenges getting to a healthcare provider in person. So that was very promising study. And then maybe perhaps another one I would share in this area of restoring function was a really interesting study on supplement with a substance called bile acid. So we think that people with MS have abnormalities in the way they process or produce energy and other maintenance activities in the nervous system. And these bile acids are produced by the liver, and they help the body absorb fats in the gut. And they can influence also the composition of gut bacteria, of our microbiome. And those changes in the microbiome have been shown to alter immune cell function and brain cell function. So the study that was reported last month at ECTRIMS was from Dr. Pavan Bhargava at Johns Hopkins University, who showed that a particular bile acid they showed signs of improving both physical and cognitive performance in people with MS, and that it was safe. So I'm pretty encouraged by that study and others, John.
You know, when I think back over the past 12 months, we started 2022 with the publication of the study that made a pretty conclusive case identifying the Epstein-Barr virus as a trigger for MS. Just a few weeks ago, we saw what I consider a landmark paper published that suggested a new framework for thinking about MS, talking about MS, and treating MS. There are a couple of large studies currently taking place that should provide evidence to determine whether a slow escalation or a hit 'em hard, hit 'em fast approach to prescribing disease-modifying therapies is most beneficial to the people who are on those DMTs. There's another study that's just getting started to compare treatment with autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation versus treatment with 4 high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies. And as you mentioned, there's the Pathways to Cures research roadmap with its defined pathways to stop progression, restore lost function, and end MS. And I guess that's becoming a global initiative. How many international MS organizations have signed on in support of Pathways to Cures now?
Yeah, up to now, John, we have 30 different MS organizations, both patient and professional organizations, that have endorsed the Pathways to Cures roadmap. Every major MS patient advocacy organization practically around the world and professional organization have now endorsed Pathways to Cures.
You know, I'll admit to being a bit of a sci-fi geek, and this feels a bit like that moment before they jump to hyperspace in Star Wars or warp speed if you're a Trekkie. Let me ask you, how do you see this moment in MS research?
Yeah, like you, John, I've been involved in MS research for many, many years, decades at this point, and it does feel, as your last statement sort of expressed, that our understanding is accelerating. That understanding is getting translated quickly into clinical testing. And it does feel like we're at an inflection point in our journey to find cures for MS. And as you know, this is really what inspired us, that we felt like the time was right to initiate this Pathways to Cures roadmap project, because we felt like we could talk about cures with a straight face, if you will, that was something that really is on the horizon for MS.
Just amazing. Really, really amazing when you take it all in and see where things are right now and where they're headed. And as you mentioned, the velocity of discovery just continues to amaze me. Well, Dr. Bruce Bebo, I cannot thank you enough for taking some time out to give us a complete briefing on some of the things that you felt really stood out at the ECTRIMS Congress. And I'm looking forward to talking with you next year as we get further down the Pathways to Cures roadmap and as we circle back to another ECTRIMS Congress in the fall this year in Milan.
Looking forward to it, John.
That's going to wrap up this episode of RealTalk MS. RealTalk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/276. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of RealTalk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes, and it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. And especially during the holiday season, please stay safe and make healthy choices.